Hey guys, welcome to Sports Spectrum. Today's episode is brought to you by our Sports Spectrum magazine. Make sure you subscribe at sportspectrum.com. And this magazine, man, I'm telling you, it is a great resource. If you want to read stories, in-depth stories on sports intersecting with faith in Jesus Christ. Maybe you know someone who loves sports. You want to introduce them to the gospel. Maybe you know someone who loves Jesus and they kind of like sports and you want to just share those stories. Man, the magazine is a great resource, a great periodical, and you can subscribe right now, super cheap. Here's what it is. 1 year subscription, $18. You get 4 or 5 issues per year for $18. But if you get a 2-year subscription, it's $30. So it's, again, super cheap, 2 years, $15 per year. That's $30 for 2 years of Sports Spectrum's magazine. And now we're happy to report that when you subscribe to the magazine, the actual printed magazine in your hand, you also get our digital magazine that comes to your email. You actually get the digital version before the actual print version arrives. So you have another opportunity to get the digital version and share it with somebody as well. Subscribe today to the Sports Spectrum magazine over at sportspectrum.com. sportspectrum.com.
Welcome to Sports Spectrum, where we bring Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, former ESPN producer, Jason Romano.
And welcome, everybody, to the show. I am Jason, and this is Sports Spectrum. That website, again, sportspectrum.com. And if you want to reach me directly, you can email me with a guest idea, a show note. Maybe you have some story that you want us to tell or just want to say hello. You can email me, jason@sportspectrum.com. jason@sportspectrum.com. We got a great conversation today with Mike Hamilton. He's the executive vice president at Learfield IMG College, and he'll tell you what Learfield IMG College is. They work with a bunch of different schools across the country in assisting in their broadcast operations. Mike is an industry veteran. He served nearly 19 years with the University of Tennessee, including 8 years as their athletic director, in addition to stints with Wake Forest and his alma mater, Clemson. Mike is also passionate about adoption, and that's really where the crux of our conversation turns toward. And this is a powerful one. Mike has 5 adopted children, and we share not only his adoption story, but really there is a barrier, if you want to call it that, within the adoption crisis and caring for orphans. And Mike has a passion for that, and we're going to talk about adoption here today on the show with Mike Hamilton, the executive vice president at Learfield IMG College, joining us here today on the show. What's up, Mike? How are you?
Good morning. How are you doing, Jason?
I'm great. Good to have you here on the show, Mike. I think before we get into your story and your journey, and we got a lot of different, topics, if you want to call them that we can hit on, and specifically adoption and how near and dear that is to your heart. And I want to talk about that in a little bit. Let's just learn a little bit about your role. And I think a lot of people have heard about Learfield. It's out there, but they might not know exactly what it is or what they do. So tell us about your role and about what Learfield IMG is.
Sure. Well, Learfield IMG College has been around for about 40 years, and we represent the broadcast, media rights, corporate partnership rights at universities around the country, almost 200 properties. And, that's a kind of wild and crazy job some days, particularly in the last year. We don't actually handle the live football and basketball broadcasts. Those are handled by the conference offices. But if you listen to a radio broadcast or shoulder programming, or you go to an arena and you see the sponsorship in the arena, Learfield IMG College is handling all that on behalf of the university. And we return a rights fee back to the university for the utilization of those assets in the marketplace. And it allows a university who their core concept is not related to that part of the business. They're more about their student athletes and their coaches to have someone handle it for them. And then specifically the University Partnership Group, which is the group that I'm responsible for, my team is responsible for. We are on task for negotiating the contracts with the universities for those multimedia rights. And then in addition to that, we also serve as a business development arm for our other companies that Learfield IMG College owns, like Pacquiao and CLC and Ticket Solutions, Sidearm Sports, those kinds of things.
So as I ask questions from like a 5-year-old, which is sometimes what I do here, Mike. So in essence, does Learfield IMG provide like production, right? Like, so do you work with the schools, and then let's say there's a North Carolina Duke, volleyball game. I'm making this up, right? And they want to broadcast this on their YouTube page or broadcast this on the radio, or like you said, internally. Do you, in volleyball might not have been the right sport, but maybe it is. Do you provide them the infrastructure for them, like provide people to kind of put the production on and broadcasters and things like that?
Yeah, so it's the deals are nuanced to the school, but typically speaking, if you listen to, let's use Carolina for example, if you listen to the Carolina basketball game, at the end of the game, it's going to say this has been a production of Learfield IMG College Sports, and the production of that event from a broadcast perspective on the radio and the play-by-play announcer, the color commentator, that's all coordinated through Learfield IMG College on behalf of the University of North Carolina.
Makes sense. Okay. So I hear Learfield IMG College, and the first thing I think of is it a college? It's clearly not a college, right?
No, the nomenclature is one of the things actually we've been talking about, because it can be quite confusing, because, there's also the IMG, like an IMG Academy in Bradenton, Florida, yes. IMG, the representation agency that Mark McCormick started back in the day. And the IMG College part of our business sat under that at one time, but through the merger into the college space a couple of years ago, now these two entities are together and represent those rights at universities.
Nice. Okay. I think we cleared that up, and that's a good thing for our listeners. And even for me, I'm just a curious person, and I love the broadcasting and production side of things. And having done that for so many years, that I was very fascinated kind of in terms of what exactly is Learfield IMG College. So thank you for clearing that up. I know prior to that, you were with the University of Tennessee for 19 years, including 8 years as an athletic director. You also had stints at Wake Forest and Clemson. So Mike Hamilton, what is it about the college and university world that's been, a fit for you for so many years?
I grew up in North Carolina, Jason, and, back in the 60s and 70s, ACC basketball, still today, was the thing, right? And typically in North Carolina, you followed one of the big four. And so I was drawn to that. My dad was an NC State fan. I became a Wake Forest fan through a set of circumstances, and I was drawn to the college space. I had an interest in the pros as well, but the college space really resonated with me. And so then going on to campus, I was not a student athlete. Just was a lover of college sports. Being on campus, going to the events, the energy, the pageantry around college athletics has been something I've always been attracted to. And so, when I got out of college, I actually worked for a bank originally, but I had been involved with our athletic program on a number of fronts at Clemson as an undergraduate. So when I had the opportunity to come back and get my master's, my MBA, and work for the athletic department, it was not with the intention that I might be working in college athletics. It was really, candidly, to get my master's degree. But because I worked in college athletics, I began to see that, hey, you know what? There's actually potentially an opportunity here for a career. And, just a quick story, I had an opportunity to go back in banking. Now you got to remember, these numbers are 1988. Mm-hmm. I had an opportunity to go back in banking for like $52,000 a year, which was a really good salary at the time. And I was offered a job at Wake Forest for $25,000, and I took the job at Wake Forest because, hey, college athletics, all the free T-shirts you can wear and hot dogs you can eat.
Well, first of all, I love that story, and I think especially for young people listening to this show right now, this particular episode, it's easy to get caught up in chasing the money and doing something that you're not passionate about. I have seen this. I was on the other side. I was like you. I took jobs for a lot less money because I had a passion for working in this business. And eventually that paid off, right? Even leaving ESPN to come to work for Sports Spectrum, that was a 40% pay cut. I've told that story publicly many times, but it was the passion of my faith and the passion of sports to really come in and be able to work on something for me that was more purposeful. But that's a great lesson, Mike, that you've seen. I have to imagine you would share that story with others, because when you come out of college, it's often very hard to not just run towards the money because you have debt loans and things like that. And a lot of people don't chase their passion because of that, right?
Yeah, no doubt. And I've been fortunate to be able to speak to student groups through the years by being on campus. And that's one of the things I share. I believe if you follow your passions, the rest will take care of itself, yes. At the end of the day. Candidly, I didn't, when I took that job at Wake Forest, it was not with the intention that I would one day be a director of athletics. It was to be around the game, to work at a place that I love, and to have an impact on a college campus. And, I've, poured myself into, busting it every day to deliver on behalf of our university, knowing that if you if you perform and you do your job, people will recognize that. And over time, even as competitive as this athletic industry is, and you know that well, you can make headway if you'll do your job and do it well, and just pour into what you're doing every day. And so, yeah, the dollars for me eventually came in the form of being an athletic director, but sure, that was not the goal when I started in that process. And candidly, there are days when it was better to be in one of those jobs versus being an athletic director, no doubt.
Well, that was one of my next questions, because the passion, is something that you want to follow that. But then when opportunities come and you grow and you kind of, I hate the wording of this, but it's climbing the corporate ladder, right? Opportunities to grow and increase. And those have come my way too in some form. And you're right. I think sometimes you almost wish you were just kind of down, where you started, where it was a lot less pressure. And then when you get that role, there's a lot of positive and negative to having a role like that, especially a director of athletics role, because everybody's watching, everybody's seeing. A lot of what is deemed success for you is outward facing. How are the teams doing? How are the coaches doing? What's going on behind the scenes? All of that, I think, it's got to be hard when you take a role. And obviously, like I said, there's good and bad. What was that like for you, kind of managing that, being a front-facing person at a school like Tennessee, SEC school, and, the good and the bad of having to kind of walk through a role like that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you love the place. You love the opportunity to work with the student athletes. I still sometimes get up and call them kids, but they're,
I know.
The student athletes.
I do it too, Mike.
And working with young people who come in at age 17 and 18 and they're still in their formative years and having an effect on what their life becomes as they work their way through the environment. And look, yes, there is a significant amount of attention in the SEC and a place like the University of Tennessee, but it's that way across the board, regardless of division or level. Athletics plays a significant role in the public image, like it or not, as it relates to a university or college campus. And so there's responsibility that comes to that. We happen to be a place, athletics happens to be a place where fans like to engage, and everybody's played ball at some level at some time in life, probably, right? So then all of a sudden everybody thinks they understand it and they have all the answers and they can coach it or whatever. Yeah. So opinions, you're never short on opinions. The thing that becomes difficult, candidly, Jason, is, as you would imagine, particularly at a place like a state institution, a large state institution, there are so many factions or folks that you have to respond to. State legislators, faculty, staff, donors, season ticket holders, student athletes, parents, et cetera. And so many times the actual desires of those groups don't jibe with each other, right? And so they've all got their particular agendas. And so I think, if you're in development or compliance or one of these other sectors of the athletic program, your work becomes highly specific. But once you become an athletic director, you have to become a generalist. Now you're still always going to have, something that you're better at typically, but you have to learn how to become a generalist and know how to navigate different kinds of political waters. And so for me, by nature, I'm a natural introvert. Some people think that means shy. That's not what introvert means, right? It's how you process information. But I had to become an extrovert at times at a place like Tennessee because that's what's expected of the athletic director at the University of Tennessee. It's we were fortunate to have a great team. There are, 6, 7, 8 other folks that were on my team at the University of Tennessee that are now athletic directors in the college space. And so to have the right team around you is really important. And we had some big decisions to make along the way. And hopefully we got more of those right than wrong. Obviously, there was hard along the way. That's well documented in the press over the years.
Sure.
But you're trying to do what's best for your institution every day, knowing full well that there's an incredible bright light shining on you every day, particularly in the SEC.
How do you, as a leader, and this may come into your role right now too, but I'm thinking specifically with Tennessee, where football and basketball from the outward perspective are the dominating sports, but there's all of these other sports too, right? I'm sure there's softball and there's volleyball and there's, all of these sports, all of the ones that I'm forgetting right now. So forgive me if you're listening and you go to Tennessee and you play a sport that I'm forgetting. But my thinking is, how do you cultivate an environment where those other sports, if you want to call them that, matter just as much as football and basketball, where it's clear, it's out there that those are the ones that maybe make the most money and bring in the most revenue and the most, and most fans are watching, if you will, but still understanding that these other sports are important too. How do you create sort of an environment to where it's inclusiveness, right? Where everybody feels like they are wanted and they are loved and they are, valued, I guess, even if it's not one of the higher tier sports.
Well, it's, if we're going to be, if we're going to understand the concept of team in the broader perspective as an athletic program involves everybody on every team. Right. And I, was fortunate enough to be at a place where early on there was sort of this mantra that was established that if we're going to have a sport that we're going to sponsor and engage in, we're going to fund it to the point and hire the coaches and recruit to the level to be nationally relevant. And, and so that was our focus. It didn't matter if it was soccer or baseball or softball or, tiddlywinks. If we were going to fund it and sponsor it at the University of Tennessee, our goal was to have it be maximized and give the student athletes, relatively speaking, the best possible experience they could have in terms of things that they had at their fingertips to utilize to get better as a student athlete, to schedule the appropriate way, to travel the right way. And, we were fortunate to have a lot of success for a long time across a broad spectrum of sports.
Mike Hamilton is our guest here on Sports Spectrum. He's the executive vice president at Learfield IMG College. Let's talk about your journey a little bit of faith. You were talking about passions earlier. We were talking about passions. Your passion, one of your passions, is certainly your faith. And maybe kind of walk us through the journey of your faith, where that stems from, and that point where we all have to come and make that decision for ourselves on whether we're going to believe or not.
Yeah. So yes, faith is a very important tenet of my life. And I was blessed, Jason, with growing up in a family where that was walked out every day. I have distinct memories of walking by my mom and dad's bedroom at night and my dad being down on his knees praying before he went to bed. And, when you see that every night, that has an impact on you. I can remember walking by my grandmother's house who lived next door and her reading her Bible at her kitchen table. I had, 4 or 5 ministers in my extended family, so now that does not necessarily lead you to faith, right?
That's
but
right. These
are the things that informed my life story. And so the opportunity to be around that, to see that lived out, to experience it, certainly had an impact on me. And I feel like I came to faith at a very young age. But, your faith grows over the years and you have ebbs and flows and you have things that happen in your life that you have learning experiences from. And so I would say, to me, it has always boiled down to a very simple concept. And, the idea in the Bible of faith like a mustard seed, right? I just believe if you have that much faith, you can get on the other side and start to have a broad-based understanding of what faith can mean. And then it begins to live out in your life through your study of the scripture and the way you live your life and the things you encounter in life and how you deal with those things in life. And so I've just seen how God has spoken into my life and my wife's life and our family's life multiple times. And I think I see that through this mustard seed of faith that I've been willing to say, hey, you know what? I believe. And I think if you believe, then other things start to happen. Intellectually, can I wrap my whole head around it? No, I can't. Let's be honest about it, right? And am I a perfect Christian? No, I am flawed in so many ways. And the cool thing about being a believer is I believe strongly in the concept of grace. It's undeserved mercy. And I've seen that exist in my life played out from the time I was a young person all the way up until, this morning.
Exactly. Although I was going to say all the way up until we hit record and we started talking, right? Because we need it every day at every moment. But with that walk of faith and that trusting in Christ, oftentimes, in fact, Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble. Walk me through whether it's a personal story that you've gone through. Maybe it's, something through your career. Maybe it's just another area of your life where that faith is tested, right? Your faith is tested. And that, again, that could be a personal tragedy that some people go through as well. I just talked to a person yesterday on the show who lost his wife after 30 plus years. And the faith is what got them through to be able to move forward. It's an incredible story. And I think we all have that. May not be as, deep or a different story than somebody else going through, but we all have those valleys that we have to walk through. Is there something that you can think of where that faith, man, I needed to trust in this because it's the only thing that got me through it?
Yeah. Well, look, as you would imagine, there are dozens, if not hundreds of those, right? But I'll give you two quick ones, one personal, one professional, and we can dive into that more if you want.
Sure.
On the personal standpoint, I think I'm blessed with my wife, Beth, and I grew up in the same hometown. We've been married now for 33 years. And there was a time in our life where we were desirous of having children and really weren't able to conceive, and went through all the tests and shots and all the infertility and all those kinds of things. And you begin to question, Lord, is this why? I mean, we really believe that this is a part of what we want family to look like for us. And there were some hard days. There were some tears. There were some dark days. But, we came out on the other side of that over a course of years. And I think I've shared with you offline, now I have 5 incredibly wonderful adopted children, which I would not trade that experience for anything. And by the way, that's also had its ups and downs, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. And so knowing that God had a plan during all that, and now being able to see it candidly in retrospect, was a seminal moment as it relates to growth of faith. And then professionally, look, it's without a doubt my last 2 years at the University of Tennessee. By all measures, so much was going well at the University of Tennessee. We were, the top 10, top 15 in the Directors Cup. We won a number of championships. And then through a series of events where we had to make some changes, that were hard changes for me as an athletic director, our athletic program, our university, we began to see some of the public pressure mount and some of the what appeared to be really good, unravel. And, it's hard to not take that personally at some level because, the reality is those are type jobs where the fan, anger, if you will, at some point is directed towards a position. It's at the end of the day, they don't know who the person is behind that mask, right? It's the athletic director. It's, they don't ever intellectualize it to Mike Hamilton. But if you're Mike Hamilton and you're sitting in that role, it's a really difficult thing to hear because we all want to be loved and respected at some level, right? And so going through that and then ultimately making the decision to resign and leave the University of Tennessee, a place I dearly loved. And at the time I left, had spent 40% of my adult life working there, and wondering, okay, God, things were going so well, and what happened? Well, you know what? Now, 10 years later, I see it, man. I see all the things that God had prepared for me and us and our family that I did not see when I was in the moment. Has everything been, bonbons and roses? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But I see purpose in all that.
No, that's really well said too, Mike. And I'm glad you shared that because I think we all go through valleys in our personal life and in many cases our professional life. Nobody has the perfect job and never has any issues with any role that they ever go after from a professional standpoint. And those are hard for some people, especially like yourself when it's a front-facing job. But I really want to dive into the story that you just shared about infertility a little bit. I had that story as well for 4 years. My wife and I walked through infertility, and we were able to conceive, but we have one child. We didn't adopt her, so we have one in the house. She's almost 17 now, and she's a blessing, and I wouldn't trade her for anything, just like you wouldn't trade your 5 kids. Walk me through the different emotions that you and your wife kind of had to walk through to get to the point where you were okay to adopt. I remember distinctly having a conversation with my wife early on. I think we would have changed our ways because we weren't Christians at the time, but we didn't want to adopt. We just felt like that's not in our DNA. Like we want to have a child naturally. Thankfully, we were able to, but I think I see adoption from a completely different perspective now as a follower of Christ, because we're all adopted in many ways into God's kingdom. Take me through that time when you kind of had to, I don't know if it's accept that this was the plan or make that decision that, okay, it wasn't going to happen naturally, and some of the emotions that maybe you were wrestling with God.
Yeah. And I would tell you that there was even an evolution in our adoption story because our first 2 children were adopted domestically in the United States. Yep. And I would tell you that candidly, it was about building family, our first adoptions. And so we went through this process where at one point, Jason, we were like, well, maybe we're just supposed to be the aunt and the uncle that dote on their nieces and nephews and hey, we're going to travel and double income, no kids and all that kind of thing. Yeah. But we kept having this heart tug, right? And we saw adoption played out in a real way with my wife's sister and her husband had adopted 3 little baby girls over a course of a number of years. And so, wow. and from 3 very different stories. And so we saw it being played out right in front of us there. And then I have a couple of friends who are adopted, and, just talking to them and their life experience and that kind of thing. And so when we, made the decision, hey, let's move forward with this, we jumped full in on that, right? And Madison, who's our oldest child, she will be 25 in a couple of weeks, was adopted at birth, and it was a single mom in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we will always cherish the fact that we got to meet her and spend some time with her and understand her adoption placement decision, and wouldn't trade that for anything. And then, within a 3-year period of time, we went through that again with I actually was questioning what's next, and should we do international adoption and all these kind of things. We got a friend that called my wife one day and said, hey, are you still considering adopting? My wife said, yeah. And she's like, hey, I'd love to take you to lunch. And it turns out, a friend of her husband's was pregnant and didn't have a plan for what she was going to do, but really believed that it was to place her child for adoption. And
wow.
We ended up walking through that pregnancy with her. Her name's Jennifer, in Knoxville. And my wife actually cut the cord in the delivery room. Then that's our son, Matthew. He's now 21. And I was in the waiting father's room, and my wife went through Lamaze classes and all those sort of things, and she cut the cord in the delivery room. It's just an amazing story. And so, look, the reality is we thought that was it. We had 2 babies, and they were 3 years apart, and life's good. And, got the dog. We're living in the suburbs. I'm, doing the AD thing. But at some point, Beth and I were never really initially on the same page about should we adopt again or not, or what that should look like. But we came together. We were having dinner one night, and I remember she had been to this conference, and she was crying, and she just said, I just really feel moved that it's time to do this again. And we that night, we went home, and a friend of hers who they had kind of had a little book club put a book in our mailbox, and it was a 400-page book about the HIV/AIDS crisis in Ethiopia. It's called "There's No Me Without You," and it's written by Melissa Green. And we were getting on a plane the next day to head to an athletic director event in Colorado, and Beth was reading the story, and I had Ethiopia on my heart. I don't know why, but I had Ethiopia on my heart, and well, I now know why. But anyway, so my wife looks at me and she says, it's Ethiopia, isn't it? And I said, yeah, I really believe it is. And so then we had this crazy thought that if we were going to adopt one child from Ethiopia, then let's adopt 2, because, hey, having someone who looks like you and sounds like you and has the background you have would make some sense. And we have a little bit of debate on how this actually went down, but I like to say that at the end of the day, my wife said, well, if we're going to adopt 2, why don't we just leave it open-ended that we would take more of it, but keep a biological family together? Well, guess what? We get a call, several months later after we'd gone through the process, that there was a biological sibling group of children in Ethiopia that they were looking for a family for. And it was a 7-year-old boy, a 4-year-old boy, and an infant. And so their mother had passed from the effects of the HIV/AIDS crisis, and their father had also passed. And so in East Tennessee in the spring, Jason, you get this warm air, but we had a pool, and if you don't heat your pool, when you jump in the pool, it's quite crispy and quite cold, right? Yeah. And I to think we would go from 2 children to 5 children in the midst of me also trying to be an athletic director in the SEC was kind of crazy in some ways. But I just told Beth, I'm like, look, hold my hand, let's jump in this pool. And, after you get in a pool in the spring in that situation in East Tennessee, after a few short minutes, your body adjusts and it becomes refreshing. Right. Well, we jumped in the pool and we adjusted. And it became refreshing. And so very shortly thereafter, I guess it was about 2 or 3 months afterwards, we went to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and we brought home our other 3 children. So now we're a family of 5. And I never in my wildest of dreams would have thought that we would have had 5 children, but here we are. And there are a lot of stories there.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, we could spend a whole nother hour probably just picking through each child and telling stories about each of them and what this has been like. But there's a crisis, an orphan crisis out there, right? And I think that's kind of where your heart has led to, even not just adopting the kids that you have adopted, but even just being involved in bringing more awareness and caring for orphans and reducing the barriers that are there with adoption. Because that's why I wanted to start with first is the barriers. A lot of people hear about adoption, but then they look at the numbers that it costs and the unfortunate things that you have to go through, which I get why. I understand that some of the protocols are in there. My brother just adopted a baby girl a couple years ago, and I watched him walk through this. And even though the mother was like, yes, take my child and care for them because I can't, there's still so many legal things you have to go through, and it costs a lot of money. And I hear 5 kids automatically, Mike, and I think, my goodness, that must have been so expensive. That's a barrier, I would say, because these kids need homes. There are people who want to have children like you, like we did, and they're not able to. Can you take me through what those barriers are that exist? And then we'll get into, the work that you're doing with Show Hope.
Yeah. So let me back up 1 second to.
Sure. Yeah.
I think you're exactly right. And sometimes it would be easy if you're on the other end of this podcast as a listener to say, okay, 5 kids, he was the AD at Tennessee, whatever, I can't do that, expense, my lifestyle, whatever. Here's what I would say. And I've said this in public forums a lot of times. Our call was to Ethiopia. Your call doesn't have to be to Ethiopia. Right. It could be to adopt out of the foster care system in the United States, which there's a much lower threshold financially to do. Now, you still have the financial commitment of life once you bring the child into your home, but the, right. The idea of the child coming in your home initially, the costs are minimized compared to adopting 3 children internationally.
Yes,
you don't have to. I don't believe everybody's called to adopt, Jason. I mean, there's some people that feel like, okay, there was this time in Christian circles where everybody felt like, okay, I have to adopt, right. Because the Bible says care for widows and orphans, right? Yeah. Well, it doesn't say necessarily adopt widows and orphans. It says care for widows and orphans.
Care for them, that's right.
And so I think it can be support of a family member who's adopting. It can be giving to foster agencies. It can be, pouring into children in their neighborhoods who are in adverse circumstances. My question I have of folks as it relates to this particular endeavor and conversation is, what's your Ethiopia? It doesn't have to be going to Ethiopia. What is your Ethiopia? So it's hard. You can't walk into this with blinders on. When you have adopted children, they come with hurt and wounds, right? Because the natural progression of life has been interrupted, and from a biological perspective. And I'd still believe that God has an intention for them to be where they are, right? But even having said that, the actual wiring neurologically, there's a separation there. And so you have to know that as an adoptive parent, number one. Number two, there is significant expense involved in it. And the good news is there are a lot of organizations that are helping families with that expense. Show Hope was one of those who I worked alongside Show Hope, with Show Hope for a long time and served as a board member. And we can talk a little bit about that if you want. They provide adoption grants for families. Yeah. And then there's you have to clear the intellectual space to know that it's a commitment. And, it's not adopting is not, playing with toys. It's like, I'll never forget the caseworker when we adopted Madison. She had picked Madison up from the hospital and brought her to us at the offices. She walked in the door. Now, you got to remember, we hadn't experienced a pregnancy or anything like that. And she placed Madison in my wife's hands, and she said, hey, she was fed about an hour ago. I'm going to run down to McDonald's before we do this placement ceremony. And she left. I mean, literally just turned around and left the building. And you're sitting there and you're holding this newborn infant. Madison at the time was less than 36 hours old. We had not had a pregnancy to go through. Candidly, we weren't fully prepared because you get the call and it's like, hey, come to Raleigh. And we're going, oh, my word, this is like a living, breathing child. Now, look, biological birth, you still have the same thing, right? But we had this shock as an adoptive family, and I think that you have to be prepared for that. So financial barriers, yes. Barriers as it relates to understanding the full depth and breadth of the hurt or the loss that comes with this. But then being prepared to say, all right, I'm stepping into this. God's called us to this. And now we've got a full-time commitment to it.
Amazing stories, Mike. I think I got two more questions I want to ask you as we wind down here. Mike Hamilton is our guest on Sports Spectrum. So I talk a lot about lessons learned from God in our life. And I like to ask that question. What's God teaching you, whether it's right now, whether it's over the years? So for you, I think a more specific question might be, what has God taught you and shown you through adoption, through your experience in adopting 5 kids? What has the Lord revealed to you through this?
Yeah. Well, the Bible says he's adopted us, right?
Yeah.
And so knowing the messiness that being a parent and seeing what all this looks like, I'm messy as it relates to my relationship with God, right? But he loves me full well and has given incredible grace. And that's what I'm trying to do. What Beth and I are trying to do with our children is to love them well and to give them grace and to understand that they're growing, learning human beings. And thankfully, God has allowed me that same opportunity through grace and through his death on the cross. And so that's the lesson learned from adoption is this full, unabandoned love that he has given us that I'm trying to return to my children as we walk through this time with them.
Yeah, that's really good. And you mentioned your involvement with Show Hope. That's my last question. I want to kind of not leave here without you talking about that organization. It's dedicated to caring for orphans and reducing barriers to adoption. Tell us about Show Hope, what it is, and your involvement with it.
Yeah, so just very simply, Stephen Curtis Chapman and his wife, Mary Beth Chapman, started this out of their adoption story. We came to know them through mutual friends a number of years ago and actually held a fundraiser to their benefit when I was living in Knoxville, when we were living in Knoxville, and got to know them a little bit better and eventually joined their board. And then after a season working in Africa around the water and HIV/AIDS initiatives and actually thinking I was headed back into athletics, their original executive director resigned, and through a matter of circumstances, I ended up serving as their executive director for 4 years and got to walk alongside them. And they just do tremendous work. And Emily Chapman Richards is the executive director there now. That's their oldest daughter, whose vision it was for them to originally adopt Shohana Hope. And that eventually became the name of the organization, Show Hope. Yeah. And so anyway, Stephen Curtis and Mary Beth, Stephen both of them have really used their platform to speak out on behalf of adoption and kids who are in hard circumstances. And so really the work was to provide grants to families who are wanting to adopt and need that extra little bit of cash to get over the top. In addition, for a long time, there was work in China where children were suffering, and they started Maria's Big House of Hope and brought children into care and put them in a place where they would be healthier to go back into the orphan care system in China or be adopted somewhere in the world, most primarily in the United States. And then this Empowered to Connect work that I just talked about related around trauma. If you're going to adopt, then you need to know how to be forward facing on that. And that organization has been committed to that as well. I love their work, and as I said, was involved as a donor and a board member and as executive director for a while up until a couple of years ago, until I came on board here at Learfield. And for anyone who's interested in learning more about that, I would encourage them to reach out to the organization. I know they'd love to hear from you.
That's great. It's called Show Hope, and he is Mike Hamilton, now working with Learfield IMG College as their executive vice president. Many years, we'll say, with Tennessee and working in other colleges, and like he said, his work with Show Hope. I love the adoption story, Mike. I hope people were encouraged as they listened. Really glad that we were able to connect. Thanks for joining us today on the show, and we'll have to have you back on again. Thanks for joining us.
Have a blessed day.
Thanks to Mike Hamilton for joining us here today on Sports Spectrum. And again, a powerful story of adoption. I hope that encouraged you, because adoption near and dear to my family. As I mentioned, my brother has adopted a baby girl, and I've just seen up close the power of adoption. And, if that's tugging on your heart and you're just trying to figure out what is your Ethiopia, Mike mentioned a specific book called The Connected Child that you can go pick up, The Connected Child. You can also learn more about Show Hope if you Google Show Hope, and you can go to their website and check out more about the work that they do. An organization dedicated to caring for orphans and reducing barriers to adoption. That's called Show Hope, and he is Mike Hamilton. Thanks to Mike for joining us here today on the show. We also want to thank you for listening. Make sure you check out our website again, sportspectrum.com. Subscribe to our magazine right there on the website, and you can also get our daily devotional, as well as all of our podcasts are available to listen there at sportspectrum.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time right here on the show. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day.